And let's do it. Oh, all right. So I'm just gonna make sure I've closed my email so it doesn't buzz at us. All right. Okay. It's kind of weird that it all of a sudden got quiet. So as most of you know, for the last 3 years, I have been working on my degree in mental health counseling with a concentration in somatic counseling and dance movement therapy at Naropa University. So at Naropa, the way that we begin all of our meetings is by marking the beginning with a gesture or a bow or a breath. And so we're going to begin this meeting together in that way too. So just taking a minute, maybe taking a breath, and in whatever way feels right to you to mark this time, let's do that now. Okay, so the title of my final paper is Shake It Out, a dance movement therapy technique to combat counselor burnout. Oh, and real quick, I wanted to give a little bit of a pointer about the Zoom. So now that we're in share the screen mode, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can kind of mess with how many people you can see. You can see just me, you can see multiple people. You can also move the little, the box that has the video, you can move it around the screen, which you may have to do because if you want to see all of the things on the slides. And you can also minimize it so you don't see anything. So, okay, let's begin. All right, so that is not how we're going to begin. We're going to begin with this. All right, so this is the quote that I used to begin my paper. And it says, "The body awaits the signal to shake and quake to bring forth a healing recalibration of its balance and place in the world." And Bradford Keeney said that, and we will hear more from him later on. So first, we're going to start by talking about counselor burnout, which is a state of emotional exhaustion, physically, emotionally, and mentally, and is possibly the single most common personal consequence of practicing therapy. So there's a lot that can contribute to counselor burnout, and I'm just going to talk about a few of those things right now. So vicarious trauma can be thought of as the emotional residue that is left over after a counselor works with a client who shares their fear, pain, or terror that they have experienced from trauma. The repercussions of vicarious trauma in the body may surface as pain, shortness of breath, an activated nervous system, feeling frozen, hypervigilance, or holding the body in a specific posture. So compassion, that word comes from two Latin words, cum and pati, meaning suffering with or together. And a really important part about counseling work is to share in the suffering with others. But when counselors become fatigued due to this sharing, it makes it difficult to provide supportive services to clients and can also lead to counselor burnout. And stress, counselors encounter stress-inducing situations frequently as they work with clients who may be struggling with emotionally draining content. Physiological and psychological reactions to chronic stress can put people at risk for learning dysfunction, memory deficits, and vulnerable to diseases. The culmination of stress over time can eventually lead to counselor burnout. So humans hold stress not only in their mind, but in their bodies. And addressing both the physiological and the psychological impact of stress can support physical and emotional health. Since counselors experience stress in their mind and their body, a somatic or body-based coping skill can support counselors in managing their stress in order to avoid counselor burnout. Okay, so I'm an epileptic. I have a genetic type of epilepsy called juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, and that's characterized by myoclonic seizures, which are jerks or spasms. They kind of look like this. I also have generalized tonic-clonic seizures, where I lose consciousness and my entire body shakes. And after I have a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, I feel reset. And I mean, occasionally something else will happen, like I'll hurt myself a little during one of those seizures, but there is something about it that actually feels really good. And so I started to get curious about that, and wondered if it was because I shook for several minutes. And so for the past few years, I've been allowing myself to shake whenever I feel like it, which turns out is pretty often. And so that's kind of where this technique came from, was from my epilepsy. So while writing this paper, I researched about shaking in animals and in humans. Peter Levine observed that animals recover from stressful situations by shaking and trembling in order to restore balance, noting how deer move from being alert and ready for danger, and then trembling and shaking in order to move into relaxation. And Bradford Keeney believes shaking is the way that animals keep themselves fit and adjusted and ready for the next dramatic enactment of life. So the next thing we're going to look at is some dramatic enactments in some animals' lives. We can see how they respond. So in this first video, we're going to watch an impala who has a pretty traumatic event happen. And we'll see here at the beginning, the impala is collapsed, as you can see why. And so fortunately for this impala, a hyena comes off and chases our feline friend away. And fortunately again, for the impala, the hyena doesn't seem to take interest. So now we can watch how the impala recovers from this trauma that it experienced. All right, gets some shake on and is ready to go. So the next one we're going to watch is a polar bear who was shot with a tranquilizer for what appears to be research purposes. Here we go.
If you watch that animal after he finishes convulsing, you'll see, because he's aware of the fact that we're all around him, and it's a very stressful experience for an animal like the polar bear. And after he settles down, and then he'll start doing a couple of deep breaths, and then he'll breathe really nicely. And here he goes. See how he's breathing there now? You can see, so that even though it looks a little unpleasant, but it's not convulsing like that. In fact, it lets off all that stress, and he then is able to relax and sleep the thing off.
Okay, so there we got to see how a polar bear shakes off stress. So humans also experience involuntary shaking after a traumatic event. And Peter Levine said that after a traumatic experience, there can be undischarged residual energy in the body that can lead to a variety of symptoms, including anxiety and depression and other psychosomatic symptoms. And maybe you yourself or somebody you know has had an experience of, for example, being in a car crash and had involuntary shaking happen after that. So Bradford Keeney was struck by a lightning bolt and spontaneously began shaking. And he's continued to allow himself to shake throughout his life. And that took him to Namibia, where he spent time with the Kalahari Bushmen, one of the world's oldest living cultures. And they practice a healing dance that involves communal trembling to heal individuals in the community. The Bushman shamans begin the shake in their own bodies to use as medicine to heal others. And Keeney asserts that ecstatic shaking is the last great taboo for the technologically developed but spiritually underdeveloped world. And so shaking practices have been and are still found in spiritual and religious communities across the globe, particularly where shamans are present. Often shaking traditions are said to have a universal force that is the impulse for the shake. In South Africa, the San healers take a person's sickness into themselves and release it by shaking their hands and their body. Shamans can be identified by shaking by the Dene, Cree, Ojibwe, and Mi'kmaq Native Americans in North America. Shaking is also found in Christian traditions. Pentecostal Christians in Mexico will sometimes shake or tremble in glossolalia, which is speaking in tongues when they have been baptized by the Holy Spirit. George Fox, who is said to be the founder of the Quakers in Britain, elicited shaking and quaking from his congregation during his sermons. Sounds like some pretty awesome sermons. But Fox and others headed to America to escape religious persecution, only to receive continued persecution and eventually abandoned shaking altogether. The Shaking Quakers, a sect of the Quaker traditions, would sit in silence and wait for the Spirit of God to move them, which often came in form of fits of shaking. And this picture that I just added is the ritual dance, and for the Shaking Quakers, they also have some shaking in their ritual dance. Okay, so this is John Slocum. He is a member of the Squaxin Island tribe in Puget Sound. And in 1882, when he was on what they thought was his deathbed, his wife, Mary Thompson, went outside, and as she was praying, she was given the gift of shaking from God. She went in and touched her husband, and he revived and said that God had sent him back to start a church that would later be known as the Indian Shaker Church. And shaking became a ritual practice in this church. So John and Mary rejected the healing practices from native shamans when they adopted Christianity, but the Puget Sound natives were already familiar with healing powers of shaking from the spirit canoe healing ritual and from native shamans in the area. And so there are also individual shaking practices that I learned about. In Qigong, which is a movement and breathing practice that originated in China but is now practiced worldwide, there is an exercise called the trembling horse, where practitioners shake and tremble while standing. And that's kind of some of the movement that happens in shaking in the trembling horse. Kim Eng, the creator of Presence Through Movement, instructs a shaking technique intended to invigorate the qi, or life energy. In this practice, she shakes each limb independently, followed by shaking her entire body while keeping her feet on the ground. And she emphasizes surrendering into the shaking to allow the qi to flow. In the last decade, Dr. Bercelli has found promising results from a therapeutic technique called tension and release exercises, or TRE. He proposes that self-induced shaking can potentially be the brain's deliberate activation of the autonomic nervous system to down-regulate an overexcited system. So shaking helps us calm down. And these self-induced shakes can be utilized to help people recover from stress and trauma. Shaking has also been used in therapeutic settings in order to help clients restore balance. Brazilian psychotherapist Axtine developed trance therapy that involves involuntary movements, which can facilitate an emotional release and can sometimes appear to be an epileptic fit or shaking. And so now I'm gonna get into a little bit about dance movement therapy, and but particularly some concepts that I used to as I was to develop this technique. So the American Dance Therapy Association provides a pretty clear and concise definition of what dance movement therapy is, which is the psychotherapeutic use of movement to promote emotional, social, cognitive, and physical integration of the individual for the purpose of improving health and well-being. So dance movement therapist Trudy Shoup prioritize giving permission for physical self-expression to her clients, direct release of emotion by adding dance and rhythm, which promoted an external embodiment of the internal emotional experience and often elicited a cathartic release. Bartenieff emphasized the need to work with the movement impulse, which is what motivates a person to move. She encouraged those she worked with to cultivate their own personal sensitivities to their impulses, which is definitely part of the technique. Authentic movement, which was developed by dance movement therapy pioneer Mary Whitehouse, is a practice that invites the participants to follow their movement impulses in order to access their subconscious and instinctual resources through the practice. Whitehouse differentiated between I move versus I am moved. The latter occurs when the individual surrenders and relinquishes control. And Susan Aposhian, who is a somatic body psychotherapist, defines sequencing as the uninhibited flow of energy within all parts and aspects of the body, mind, and between ourselves and the environment. In order to shake, one has to let go, in a sense, which allows energy to flow uninhibited and can provide for a cathartic release. So after observing her clients and students over several years, Dr. Christine Caldwell, a dance movement therapist, instructor, and founder of the Somatic Department at Naropa University, observed a process that occurred during a healing journey and developed the moving cycle. The moving cycle begins with the awareness stage, which is characterized by tuning into, sensing, and identifying something that one has not consciously been aware of. For instance, noticing thoughts of blaming or noticing tension in the shoulders. The second stage is owning, where one takes responsibility for what has been realized in the awareness stage. Here, a commitment to staying present with and staying curious about previously disowned feelings and sensations is required. In the appreciation stage, one can recover the ability to unconditionally accept aspects of the self that have been rejected. Here, internal resources are accessible and one can move with them, and a sense of wholeness may be felt. And finally, the action phase is marked by taking the experience that has occurred in the previous phases and applying it to daily life into relationships with others. So in order to prevent counselor burnout, counselors need to be able to assess their levels of stress and be mindful of the potential for vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. Being aware of the impact of working as a counselor is only the first step. A counselor also needs to address the repercussions in the mind, body, and spirit. A dance movement therapy technique can provide an opportunity for the counselor to sequence emotion not only in the mind, but also in the body. The following technique, Shake It Out, incorporates the movement cycle to help counselors combat with counselor burnout. The Shake It Out technique can be done alone or with others. There are benefits to each way of practicing. Since shaking is often pathologized, the impulse to shake may be suppressed or ignored. The counselor may need to intentionally acknowledge to themselves that shaking in their body is okay. It is also possible that a counselor does not have any idea how to shake their body. Shaking can include one part of the body, or it can include the entire body. It can be subtle, or it can be robust and vigorous. One can be standing, sitting, lying down, kneeling, or in other positions. So in the awareness, there we go. In the awareness stage of the Shake It Out technique, the counselor is encouraged to begin by checking in with their body. And they are, and especially checking in with what the impact of working as a counselor is. And that could be from one particular session, or it could just be the work in general. Aspects of working as a counselor, such as dealing with crises, paperwork, dealing with traumatized clients, having a large caseload, spending all day on Zoom, are all areas where counselors may feel an impact. The owning phase of the shaking technique involves consciously recognizing that whatever was noticed during the awareness phase belongs to the counselor. If, for example, a counselor experiences vicarious trauma from working with a client, it's important that they acknowledge that the tension, if that's what they're experiencing, is their own tension and isn't the client's. So taking ownership of what is happening in their own body and mind. In the appreciation phase of the technique, the counselor can be grateful for the information that the body is given. In a culture where the body is often only looked at as a tool, it can be healing to respect the information and wisdom in the body. Finally, the action phase of the shaking out technique involves shaking. The counselor can allow their body to shake, following whatever impulse is present, allowing thoughts to drift into the background. If no impulse to shake is present, choose one of the options that I'll demonstrate here in a little while. And the recommendation is to shake for at least 3 minutes. And while I shake pretty much every day, it's usually not for 3 minutes. However, what I found is that when I really want something to shift or move or release or sequence, if I set a timer for 3 minutes and continue to make myself shake for 3 minutes, something always shifts and moves. As the shake comes to a close, either because the desired time is completed or because the shake feels complete, allow those movements to gradually stop. And then finally checking back in with the body, with the breath. And if at any point the shaking becomes too intense, the counselor is invited to stop shaking and engage in a grounding practice. So the shaking technique is designed to be adaptable to the counselor's desires, ability levels, and environmental constraints. This technique can be used in between sessions, at the end of the day, or as a transition between work and home. It could be done for shorter or longer periods of time, depending on personal needs and desires. It is a useful somatic or body-based technique to use when there is not much space to move around. Like in a bathroom stall, you can cry and shake. So I'm going to briefly share how I've used this in my own life. So at my internship, I have worked with a 10-year-old client who I became pretty emotionally attached to. And over the course of our time, she shared with me a number of things about the way that her mother was treating her that I had to report to Child Protective Services. On my third report, they did open up a case, and the father called me and said, would you be willing to talk to her about, they want to interview the client, would you be willing to talk to her about it? And I said, sure, I'd be happy to, which I was. However, before I got into the session, I felt overwhelmed and I wondered how I was going to be able to survive in this career. So perfect time to use my technique. So in the awareness phase, I took note of the ball of tension in my chest, and I noticed the thoughts of helplessness I was having. I accepted the cognitive and somatic cues I was experiencing. I accepted that the cognitive and somatic cues I was experiencing were mine and not my clients in the owning phase. In the appreciation phase, I was able to be thankful to my body for giving me this information. Finally, I set a timer and shook for 3 minutes. In the middle of my shaking, I felt that ball of tension in my chest release. After I finished shaking, I remembered that I love the work I do partly because it's challenging. I'm grateful that I get to do this work, that I get to help people even when it's hard for me and for them. And after shaking, I felt confident that I could go into the session and have a helpful and supportive conversation with my client. So caution is advised when working with this somatic dance movement therapy technique, because working with the body may bring up unexpected feelings, thoughts, sensations, or emotional responses. Bring in a mindful, non-judgmental attitude, gentleness, and compassion to any of these unexpected responses. A grounding practice may be helpful for coping with unexpected responses. Also, it is important to take into consideration one's socio-cultural locations, as there may be a range in comfortability to movement and shaking based on cultural expectations, ability level, gender, age, etc. Another possible application of this technique could be using this technique as an intervention with clients. Additionally, this technique could be used for other professionals who are at risk for burnout. While writing this paper, questions arose for me around how counselor burnout is related to spirituality, religion, and community involvement, but that is beyond the scope of this paper and this presentation. So since counselor burnout is prevalent, further study is needed in order to address how dance movement therapy can be used to support counselors in finding balance. A few options for types of, so now it's shaking time. And so I'm gonna stop the screen so I can see you all. So I'm gonna show you a few of the ways that I shake. And then I'm gonna invite you to shake with me. So one easy way to start shaking is just in the hands. You can do this with me now, and you can also do it, we'll also have a minute to do it. You can also get some shoulder shaking in. There's the up and down, the side to side. Also, you can kind of get your whole body shaking. And right now I'm kind of pressing my legs against the ground and get my whole body shaking. Another shake that I really like to do, I call the head tail shake. So we've got our head, we've got our tail, and in slow motion when you do it, there's kind of like I'm moving my head and tail to the same side of the body in kind of a C forms, which you might be familiar with yoga. And so you can kind of get it going pretty fast. This is the best. All right, so let's just take a minute and all shake together. And you can be standing, sitting, kneeling. Awesome. It can be a little shake. It can be a big shake. If it's uncomfortable, it's okay to stop. But I invite you to try to shake. I'm seeing some awesome shaking here. Great. Okay, I've really been looking forward to that for a long time, so thank you for shaking with me. All right, we're gonna share the screen a little bit more. So vicarious trauma, compassion, fatigue, and stress are realities for those working in the counseling field. In order to prevent counselor burnout, counselors need practical tools that are adaptable, accessible, and effective. The Shake It Out dance movement therapy technique fills a gap in the counseling and dance movement therapy fields. Shaking has been practiced in communal and individual contexts across time and across the globe for health and well-being. Dance movement therapists and counselors can access the wisdom and healing and sequencing that come from a shaking practice by using this technique. So here are a few references that I listed. I have so many more references, and if you want any more information about this, please let me know. And the last thing I need to do is say some thank yous. So I want to thank Heather Sutton, who is my reader and who gave me the idea to use the moving cycle with my technique, which was awesome. Lauren, who was my cohort member, whose idea it was to combine this shaking practice with counselor burnout. Thanks, Lauren. Definitely want to thank my family, my parents and my sister, my cousin Blake, my Nini, and so many others have been so supportive of me during this entire process. And shouldn't look at my mom because she's crying. And my partner, Len, who has just stood by me this entire time, giving me support and love, and has helped me with all of this. And my cohort, whom I love and have supported me and shook with me the whole 3 years, and the faculty who have been there and just been awesome supporting me. And all of you, because this was awesome. I was so sad to not be able to share this in person, but this totally made up for it. It's really special to have all of you here in this virtual space. And so I am going to unmute you all, and we'll have a few minutes for questions. All right, you're unmuted.
I have a question.
Oh man, I have your chocolate ice cream.
Thank you.
Nice.
Anybody has questions? We'll have a few minutes. It might kick us off, and then we can still get back on though. If it
I have a question.
Tim has a question.
You showed the animals and humans, they were unconscious when they were shaking. Is there a difference between the violent, the conscious shaking and the being unconscious versus conscious?
Yeah, so the animals, I think, were conscious while they were shaking, but I mean, I can't really speak for the animals. It seems to be involuntary. I think there is a difference between, you know, conscious or unconscious shaking and voluntary or involuntary shaking. And, you know, I think both of those can happen. I guess you can't really do a voluntary unconscious shaking. But, yeah, I mean, I think that different stuff happens with each of those. Not sure if I answered the question. Do you have more of a question that I didn't answer?
No, that was it. I just didn't know, you know, obviously you're trying to get a certain out. voluntarily shaking. And I just didn't know if it was as satisfying as something that you can't control.
Kim, that's such a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. Like from my experience as an epileptic and as also an intentional voluntary shaker, I think that there is something very profound about how I feel after I get done with a seizure. That, but at the same time, I think they're different. And I guess we'd have to ask other folks who are epileptics and also practice shaking to kind of get a sense of, or other people who have experienced involuntary shaking. But I think that's a really great question, and I don't actually know the answer. Thanks, Kim.
Marcy, it's Lee. I have a question for you. So I completely can see how you could use this in a classroom. You were talking about some grounding strategies. If you were to do this maybe with a group of people, some strategies for grounding other than yelling and telling them to come back, like a more calm way of saying, okay, let's come back to the group, you know what I mean? Because this could get a little bit exciting at some times. So.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts right off the bat. One is, like I mentioned, like shaking can kind of potentially bring up stuff for people that is uncomfortable. So, and I was gonna have you guys do this and I forgot to do it because I didn't write it in my notes, but one grounding technique that's pretty easy to do with multiple people is to, and you guys can all do it right now, you identify something in the room that makes you happy or makes you feel good. And so, if somebody becomes uncomfortable, dysregulated by doing this, inviting them to go back to that thing can help them ground. Also, things like inviting people to touch and feel their feet against the ground. There's 5 senses, identifying things with your 5 senses. Say, I see I can see my plant, I can see my computer, I can touch the wall, I can't really hear too much talking, I can hear myself talking. So engaging with the 5 senses. But then it sounds like you're also talking about kind of more classroom management type of thing if you get them shaking. Yeah. Right. I'm a huge fan of the clapping. My mom does this a lot.
Right.
You would all do it. But, that would just be, it's true. You get them all riled up. And I haven't done this with a group of kids. So I've only done it with adults and they stay pretty calm. So I'd have to think more about that. Like I said, if this cuts me off, then feel free to get back on and I'll continue answering questions and we'll have a dance party at the end. So.
No, thank you. Perfect.
Cool. We can talk more about it, Lee, some other time. Yeah. Yeah, I see Chris.
Definitely.
Lee. I think that a comment that I have, one of the first times in life that I saw involuntary human shaking was watching my father yawn pretty late at night. And I think I started doing this in my adult life, but I don't remember doing it as a child. And it's just something interesting to note. And maybe you can tell, if you know anything about it, Marcy, maybe you can add, but and I don't know if anybody's ever witnessed this, but my father would just do a big yawn and then his head would shake as he released his yawn, like in the second half of his yawn. And I've noticed myself doing that more in my adult life, and I think more and more as I get older. Do you know anything about that? It seemed like the yawning was voluntary, but the shaking was possibly involuntary a little bit. And that's how it seems for me. Do you know anything about that, Marcy?
No, there's not anything that I've encountered any research about with that type, specifically with that type of